Guy de Maupassant grew up in a region of northern France called Normandy. It's a seaboard province and renowned for its produce. This is the land of camembert and calvados, cider and seafood. Within France, the Normans had a reputation for being insular and provincial. Unfair though this may be, it's a theme that Maupassant explored in his writing.
Inside the coach, the travellers inspected one another inquisitively in the melancholy light of dawn. In the best places at the far end, Monsieur and Madame Loiseau, wholesale wine merchants in the Rue Grand Pont, sat dozing opposite each other. Once the clerk to a wine merchant who had gone bankrupt, Loiseau had bought the business and made a fortune. He sold very bad wine at very low prices to the small retailers in the country, and was regarded by his friends and acquaintances as a cunning scoundrel, a typical Norman full of guile and joviality. Next to them, and more dignified, as befitted a member of a superior social class, sat Monsieur Carré-Lamadon, a man of substance with a solid position in the cotton business. Throughout the period of the Empire, he had remained the leader of the benevolent opposition, simply in order to extract a higher price for his support of a policy which he fought with what he called gentlemanly weapons.
Though the Maupassant family were aristocratic, and Guy's father didn't need to work for a living, they weren't above petty snobberies themselves. His mother's claims that her son was born in the local chateau are now disputed by the discovery of a birth certificate, giving a much less glamorous birthplace for the writer. Gustave de Maupassant was a womanizer, and his constant affairs eventually led to a permanent separation from his wife when Guy was just 11 years old. Guy's schooling was largely informal until he was sent to a Catholic boarding school, where he was a good student, although unhappy with the school's discipline and conditions. He did eventually pass his exams and went to study law in Paris. But by this time, he had established what would become an influential relationship with the writer Gustave Flaubert, author of Madame Bovary, who provided something of a father figure for Guy. But Laure also entertained literary hopes for her son, who displayed a gift for storytelling, particularly in his letters from the Franco-Prussian front, where he served first as a private in the field, and later, through his father's intervention, as a quartermaster.
I have told the driver of the coach to give you news of me, dear mamma. But fearing he might not be able to, I am writing to you myself. I have fled with our army in retreat. I was very nearly captured. I went from the vanguard to the rear of the column to carry an order from the officer in charge to the general. I have done 15 leagues on foot. After having walked and run all the previous night to carry messages, I slept on the stone floor of an ice-cold cellar. If I hadn't such sturdy legs, I'd have been taken prisoner.
Guy's youthful enthusiasm for the war was stopped in its tracks when Paris surrendered in January 1871. He keenly felt the humiliation of the French army and deplored the cowardly complacency of the middle classes.
A Prussian officer came and walked through Etretat in full uniform. The local population rioted at the outrage. Then several shopkeepers and I went off to speak to the mayor about it. He told us in an insolent manner that the French people were noisy louts and cowards, and that since the Prussians had beaten us, we had no cause to complain.
A disillusioned Guy was demobilised and resumed his legal studies. His father also found a post for him as a minor civil servant. He was bored by the work, but enjoyed his life enormously, boating on the Seine, swimming and courting young women of dubious reputation.
She was absolutely crazy into the bargain. She told us that she had been born with a glass of absinthe in her belly, which her mother had drunk just before giving birth to her, and she had never sobered up since, because, she said, her nurse used to keep her strength up with tots of rum. She always called the bottles lined up on bar-room shelves "My Holy Family." Every week our yawl would travel along the Seine with a load of 5 light-hearted, strapping young fellows, steered by a lively, scatterbrained creature under a parasol of painted paper. We adored her, first of all for a variety of reasons, and then for one in particular.
Meanwhile, Flaubert introduced Maupassant to some of the key writers of the time, Ivan Turgenev, Émile Zola, and Henry James amongst them, and counselled his disciple in his philosophy of writing.
You are young. Work for a long time in solitude and without hope of recompense, without any idea of publishing. Do as I did. I was 37 when Madame Bovary was published. You're lost if you think of making any profit from your work. You must think only of art in itself. Practice writing about things that you have felt personally, describing scenes that are familiar to you.
Guy did what Flaubert told him, but the strain of working by day, writing by night, and coping with his mother's alarming illnesses began to show.
I didn't write to you, my dear master, because my morale is completely gone. For 3 weeks I have been trying to work every night and haven't been able to write a single page. Nothing. Nothing. The result is I am gradually falling into a black depression and discouragement, and will have a hard time climbing out again.
But something more serious than just low morale was up with the young writer. He was suffering from heart palpitations, baldness, and skin problems. Guy felt that he was suffering from the same highly strung nature as his mother, while his doctors diagnosed a rheumatic condition. Flaubert, on the other hand, had more accurate ideas.
Come, my dear friend, you seem badly worried, and your worry pains me, because you could use your time more agreeably. I've come to suspect you of being something of a loafer. Too many whores, too much rowing, too much exercise. Yes, sir, civilized man doesn't need as much locomotion as the doctors pretend.
It was certainly true that Guy loved rowing, but it wasn't that particular pastime that caused his illness. Doctors now recognise the symptoms of the sexually transmitted disease syphilis in its early stage. Meanwhile, through his mentor, Maupassant joined a group surrounding the young writer Émile Zola and calling themselves naturalists. They were intent on showing the life, sufferings and exploitation of ordinary people in their books. In 1880, 1 month before the death of Flaubert, a group of 6 writers each contributed a short story on the Franco-Prussian War to a volume called Les Soirées de Mesdames. Maupassant's story, Boule de Suif, was not only the best of the 6, but possibly the best story he ever wrote. Boule de Suif means bowl of lard, and is the nickname of a young prostitute, travelling by coach, who is treated well by her middle-class fellow passengers, who are anxious to share her food. A German officer stops the coach and refuses to let it leave until she sleeps with him. The patriotic Boule de Suif refuses, but the other passengers induce her to satisfy him and then ostracize her.
Nobody looked at her. Nobody gave her a thought. She felt overwhelmed by the contempt of these respectable boors who had first sacrificed her and then cast her aside like an unclean object for which they had no further use. Then she remembered her big basket, full of good things which they had guzzled, her 2 chickens in aspic, her pâtés, her pears, her 4 bottles of claret. Her anger suddenly collapsed like a cord snapping when it has been stretched too tight, and she felt on the verge of tears. She made a tremendous effort to control her feelings, bracing herself and swallowing her sobs like a little child. But her tears welled up, glistening on her eyelids, and soon 2 great drops brimmed over and rolled slowly down her cheeks. Others followed more rapidly, flowing like drops of water trickling from a rock and falling at regular intervals onto her bosom's swelling curve. She sat erect, staring straight in front of her, her face pale and set, hoping that nobody would notice.
The story was acclaimed as a small masterpiece. Here was the despair of France defeated, the hypocrisy of the upper classes, and heroism in the most surprising of places. Short stories were a very popular literary form in France, and Maupassant became a bestseller virtually overnight. His brilliant ability to portray real people, coupled with humour and candid sexuality, no doubt won readers for collections like Madame Tellier's Establishment.
Madame Tellier's Establishment had a festive air about it. The company in the upstairs room was at full strength by 9 o'clock. Monsieur Vasse, the commercial court judge, and Madame's acknowledged but platonic suitor, was chatting quietly with her in a corner, and they were both smiling as if some agreement was about to be reached. Monsieur Poulain, the former mayor, had Rosa sitting astride his legs, and she was pressing her nose against his and running her little chubby hands through the old fellow's white side whiskers. She had hitched up her yellow silk skirt so that a patch of bare thigh showed white against the dark cloth of his trousers, and her red stockings were held in place by the blue garters the commercial traveller had given her.
Boule de Suif was still being reviewed in the press, and its author had left the civil service for journalism when Flaubert died. Suddenly deprived of his affectionate father figure and critic, Maupassant became obsessed by his memories and morbidly pessimistic. Much of this sense of despair finds its way into Maupassant's first novel, Une vie, which means a life. It's the story of Jeanne, a young Norman woman whose ideals of love are shattered by her cruel, womanizing husband, who she nonetheless refuses to leave until he has wrecked her life and his own. It's often taken to be biographical of his beloved mother's humiliation by his father. But there are no moral judgments here, merely observations of the dramas and daily preoccupations of his characters.
They climbed back into the boat. Gently it left the shore under a following wind, smoothly, without appearing to move forward. The breeze came in warm, lazy gusts, momentarily filling the sail and then letting it fall limp against the mast. The sea was opaque, stagnant-looking, and the sun, drained of its fires and pursuing its curving path, was gently sinking towards it. Again the torpor of the sea made everyone fall silent. At length Jeanne said, "Oh, how I would love to travel." "Yes," replied the Vicomte, "but there's no joy in travelling alone. There have to be two of you, at least, so that one can share one's impressions." She pondered this. "That's true. I like going for walks on my own, though, and it's so nice, just dreaming away all by myself." He looked at her for a long moment. "But two people can also dream together." She lowered her eyes. Was this a hint? Perhaps. She studied the horizon as though trying to see beyond it. Then slowly she said, "I would like to go to Italy. And Greece. Oh, yes, Greece and Corsica. It must be so wild and beautiful there."
With the success of Une vie and his career as a celebrated journalist, Maupassant's life became a round of luxury and sophistication. He began to travel and maintained an annex to his flat for clandestine meetings with women. But despite appearances, he was not a natural socialite, as this account by an acquaintance shows.
"He does not look like a man of letters. Guy de Maupassant is a fellow of 35, fairly slim, of military bearing and neatly dressed. Seen from a distance, when he does not see you looking, he has something harsh and insolent about his face, but as soon as you talk to him his expression changes. The insolence of a moment ago gives way to a polite niceness that seems quite natural. His conversation is careful and calculated. He only speaks a bare minimum and very seldom mentions himself. He does not make any verbal attacks on anyone, but his retorts can be dangerous."
Maupassant is described here as returned to full health, and this complies with stage 2 of syphilis, where the disease is no longer contagious and there are no symptoms. That's probably just as well, since he was adored by society hostesses who wanted the famous writer at their tables and in their beds. But Maupassant retained a scepticism for society and its delights. His novel Bel-Ami, which can be translated as Sweetheart, is the story of the amiable but amoral Georges Duroy and his climb up the social and political ladder by means of the women he seduces, including the newly widowed Madeleine Forestier.
He had taken the hand she had offered him and was holding it tightly, with a fervid desire to kiss it. Finally, he decided to do so, and he slowly lifted it to his lips and pressed its delicate, warm, quivering, fragrant flesh against them. Then, When he felt that his friendly gesture was beginning to be too insistent, he let her tiny hand fall gently back onto her lap. She said gravely, "Yes, I shall be very lonely, but I shall try to be brave." He could not find a way to lead her to understand that he in turn would be glad, very glad, to take her as his wife. Obviously he could not tell her in so many words at this time and place. Beside this dead body, he was embarrassed by this corpse lying rigid beside them. He felt that it was coming between them. Moreover, for some little time he had imagined that he could detect a suspicious odour in the stuffy room, a fetid breath coming from the rotting lungs, the first reek of carrion that meets the nostrils of the relatives watching over poor dead creatures as they lie on their beds, a horrible smell which will soon be filling every corner of their coffins. He asked, "Do you think we might open the window a little? The air seems tainted." She replied, "Yes, of course, I just noticed it myself." He went to the window and opened it. Cool and scented the night air entered, making the candle flames flicker beside the bed. As on the other night, the white walls of the villas and the broad, shimmering expanse of the sea were bathed in the calm, full light of the moon. Dubois filled his lungs, and felt suddenly excited by hope, and, as it were, elated by a quiver of approaching happiness.
It wasn't long before Maupassant's own health was in decline. He was developing the symptoms of late syphilis, a stage that can last for decades, resulting in brain damage, heart disease, blindness, and eventual death. There were signs that the writer was behaving outrageously in public. In 1886 he visited England, where he met Oscar Wilde and Henry James. Wilde reported that Maupassant had deeply shocked the author of A Portrait of a Lady by asking him to procure a woman for him. His writing, too, became increasingly lurid. If his novel Bel-Ami was shocking, some of his other writing at the time was nothing short of outrageous. Shelley was the story of an 8-year-old Indian mistress of a French naval officer. Yvette was a novelette about a prostitute's daughter, and The Child featured a bloody self-abortion by an aristocratic French widow. Maupassant had always had a taste for the macabre, and that, combined with fears for himself, produced a series of disturbing stories like The Orla, which is the story in diary form of a terrified madman who burns his house to destroy an evil presence.
5th of July. Have I lost my reason? What happened last night is so peculiar that my head reels just to think of it. I had locked my door, as I do now every evening. Then, feeling thirsty, I drank half a glass of water, and I happened to notice that my carafe was full right up to the crystal stopper. After that I went to bed, falling into one of my dreadful slumbers, from which I was aroused about 2 hours later by a shock more frightful than any I had experienced before. Imagine a man who is stabbed to death in his sleep, and who wakes up with a knife in his lung, with a death rattle in his throat, covered in blood, unable to breathe, on the point of death, and incapable of understanding what has happened to him. And there you have what I felt. When I had finally come to my senses, I felt thirsty again. I lit a candle and went over to the table where my carafe was standing. I picked it up and tipped it over my glass. Nothing came out. It was empty. It was completely empty. At first I was utterly mystified. Then, all of a sudden, a terrible feeling swept over me that I had to sit down, or rather, that I collapsed into my chair. My hands were trembling. Somebody must have drunk the water. But who? Oh, who can ever understand my dreadful anguish? Who can understand the feelings of a sane-minded, wide-awake, thoroughly rational man as he gazes in horror into a glass carafe, looking for a little water which has disappeared during his sleep? I stayed there until daybreak, not daring to go back to bed.
Despite the personal anguish, Maupassant was still writing coherent, immaculately written prose. In 1891, he published one of the most famous of his short stories, The Necklace, described by Henry James as a little perfection. It's a disturbing story of a young woman who loses a borrowed necklace and ruins her life in an attempt to redeem its value.
Madame Loisel looked old now. She had become the woman of impoverished households, strong and hard and rough. With brown hair, skirts askew, and red hands, she talked aloud while washing the floor with great swishes of water. But sometimes, when her husband was at the office, she sat down near the window and thought of that gay evening of long ago, of that ball where she had looked so beautiful and been so much admired. What would have happened if she had not lost that necklace? Who knows? Who knows? How strange and surprising is life. How small a thing is needed to make or ruin us.
Maupassant's own life was showing signs of ruin. His health was disintegrating rapidly. His travels continued, but what had once been carefree holidays changed into compulsive wanderings. He became increasingly sombre.
My state is well expressed by the howling of certain dogs, a lamentable complaint addressed to nothing, reaching nowhere, saying nothing, but flinging into the night the cry of chained-up anguish that I should like to utter. If I could wail like them, I should sometimes go out onto a great plain or into the depths of a wood, and I should howl for hours on end in the shadows. That, I feel, would relieve me.
Hervé, Guy's younger brother, became psychotic in 1887 and was committed to an asylum 2 years later after attempting to strangle his wife. He died shortly afterwards. Hervé's descent into insanity was a prelude to Guy's own disintegration as the syphilis attacked his spinal cord. He became obsessed with the notion that there were flies devouring his brain and attempted to shoot himself in January 1892. When this failed, he grabbed a paper knife and thrust it into his throat. He was committed to an asylum the next day. The immensely popular author of some 300 short stories, 6 novels, 3 travel books, and a volume of verse, died some months later, just before his 43rd birthday.
If he was understood and loved from the first, it was because the French soul found in him the gifts and the qualities that have created its finest achievements. He was understood because he had clarity, simplicity, moderation, and strength. He was loved because he possessed a laughing goodness, a profound satire which persists even through tears. And they were grateful to a writer, pessimist though he was, for giving them, in the perfect clarity of his works, the joyful sensation of well-being and vigour. Apart from his glory as a writer, Maupassant will always remain one of the happiest and one of the unhappiest men the world has ever seen. One of those in whom the rest of us see our own humanity aspire, and then see it shattered. The adored, spoiled brother.